Well, let's get started. And this is a really fun one today, and it's spent a lot of time researching it, so I hope you enjoy. Just a little bit of a disclaimer though, because with all the ones when it comes to science and the like, research is still very new and it's not definitive. So today we're going to give a lot of suggestions and a lot of possible reasons. But as to the real reason, the difference between male and females when it comes to dyslexia, in terms of how it shows itself, presents itself, diagnosed, it's still a very new and emerging field. More research is needed. I am Nat though, and a lot of you should remember me because I deliver the workshops every week. Now, just a really quick intro, just to make sure we're all on the same page. I work at an organisation called Exceptional Individuals, and we support neurodiverse individuals on how to get a high-end job that they absolutely love, as well as organisations to help them become more inclusive, and not just to accept us for being a little bit different, but to really utilise us and want to have us in their company. So, dyslexia and sex. We're going to be talking about gender. There's a lot of different terms when it comes to gender. And just to clarify, because sometimes I use the words interchangeably, today we're going to be talking about your biological gender. So the thing that you were born with, whether you were born male or female. If you do resonate as non-binary, just heads up, I'm not going to be referring to non-binary today. There just isn't research on it. So it's going to be mainly referring to male and female. So keep it in mind that though we do recognise it, we're not going to be focusing on those today. The first question I want to ask you though, do you think there are differences in the brain between dyslexic men and women? Remember, it's a very early research, so if you think there is or isn't, there isn't necessarily a right answer. All we can do is look at the evidence and make educated guesses or assumptions based on the data. So far we've got most of you think yes, some think no, one person is unsure. And there is differences, but those differences are small. So we are going to go into like the nitty-gritty here and look at the small differences. However, those small differences can have a massive impact. So sometimes it could just be a slight gene in our DNA. It could just be how we are taught in school or how society looks at us. The differences are not big, but they are very much there. And that's what we are going to be focusing on today. So I want to ask, are you dyslexic? It's just important for our next few questions. Okay, so we've got a nice balance today. That's good. And we want to know whether you're dyslexic or not because this will help us with some of our research and it will become a bit more clear later on why it is important to know. And it does get different because with all these things, some of the things which are exclusive to females, males do have, and vice versa. It's just the frequency isn't as much. And your sex. So here we're talking about the gender you were born with. So were you a male or a female? Like you can refer to yourself however you like, but for this we just need to know your biological. So we got mostly females and only one male. Where are you guys? But this is important because what we wanted to show here in a fair an idea is what is the likelihood of being dyslexic in male and dyslexic in female. So as we can see here, we've got 40% of the people here today are female and dyslexic. Now, if this was a little bit of a fairer representation, I would suspect we'd see more males. Because statistically, more males are dyslexic than females. And this is the assumption which most people have. Teachers have, parents have, clinical professionals, people who diagnose. And this idea of what we consider normal is also going to impact how people treat those with dyslexia later on. The next one is if you were diagnosed, and if you weren't, you don't have to reply to this one, but if you were, at what age? Were you diagnosed with dyslexia at 0 to 16, 17 to 30, or 31 plus? And this one will also do a breakdown on male and female. So as we can see here, most people were diagnosed between kind of school age. The average person is normally diagnosed either just pre-16 or just after, because that's normally when the funding is available. That's when the first signs become visible or noticeable. But one thing you will see is that males are typically diagnosed earlier than females. So when we look at later life, again, this I wouldn't say is very representational of the general population, but what you would normally see is that people who are of an older age and diagnosed typically are female. Again, why is that? Why are males more likely to be diagnosed sooner than women? And why are males more likely to be diagnosed at all? There's a lot of things here which just do not make sense unless there's something going on behind the scenes under the hood. So I mentioned to you dyslexia is more common, but how much more common do you think it is in males? And when we say more common, we mean those that are diagnosed, actual cases. Nice. You all are correct. Kinda. Ooh, that's okay. We've got a nice mixture here. So you are, well, 4 times more likely to be dyslexic if you are male. And if you go in schools, there's a whole heap of reasons why that might be. But I want to ask you why you think that might be. So why is dyslexia diagnosed in males more than females? Now, I've done a little hint here with the image, but there are so many different reasons, and there isn't a particular right answer for this. There isn't just one answer, there are multiple ones.
I think one of the main reasons why males are more diagnosed, I think they don't, I think women tend to be more sensitive and more of a caring nature than boys, and boys seem to dismiss these sensitive issues, and that's why I think it's more common in boys to diagnose. That's the first thing I can think of right now.
No, I think that's a really good answer. So we've got Erin says most research focuses on boys and girls. Yes, absolutely. And this goes back to the standard age-old problem of old white males. When you look at the people who define the subjects, people who are more likely to get educated as doctors, the people who are more likely to do the research, the people who are more likely to get the test subjects, it's always males. All the research has been done on males. The way we diagnose people hasn't changed that much, and it's still based on research that was done in the very early stages. Incredibly outdated and incredibly biased. Leanne says there is a stereotype, and therefore teachers and parents tend to look out for signs. Absolutely. Because we know dyslexia is more common in males or boys, they are the ones we're looking at. We're not looking at the girls who might show different symptoms or characteristics. We're only looking at the ones that we are very consciously aware of. So already we've got 2 biases. We've got test bias, and we've also got like knowledge bias. Muscan says perhaps because the literacy rate is high and dyslexia requires no one's literacy in order to be diagnosed. Well, that's a really good point, because we are going to get into that. Males' literacy is lower than females. On average, when you compare them, like same age, side by side, females have a higher literacy rate. And you wouldn't believe this, they have a higher literacy rate all the way until about 36, and then it kind of evens out, and then we're about even. That's ridiculous, isn't it? I couldn't believe that when I found that out. Leanne says there is a positivity bias. Yep, absolutely. It's like a feedback loop. It just keeps reconfirming. And we're also going to go on to genetics. So, for instance, when it comes to like hormones, they play a big part in it. Dyslexia and ADHD have a very high relationship, and ADHD shows itself more actively in males. So typically, those with ADHD will also get diagnosed with dyslexia, and they'll also happen to be male. So everything starts to build up here. I meant to say literacy and education both. Yeah. Well, I also got. I think girls are better at imitating behavior than boys. Yep, that's another word for that is masking. So that's where they're able to kind of slide in or just go with the status quo. Now, whether that's good or a bad thing, I think it does mean, unfortunately, that they slip under the radar because the things that people are looking for just isn't being noticed. There is greater variance in male reading performance. That is also true. Males tend to have a more fluctuating ability. Some are more higher, some are lower, but typically males do have a lower reading ability. And that isn't something which is just UK based. This has been proven all around the world, regardless of culture. Females are better at masking as society needs them to be more accommodating than males. Yeah, that's another a great one. Is it something that females are naturally born with, or is it something they grow and develop? There is a stereotype, and therefore teachers and parents tend to look out for the signs. Yeah, all really, really good answers. Interesting. In India, the school's dropout rate of women are higher, actually. That might be for other factors, though. Like, for instance, maybe they have to go at home and do, like, I don't know, more like household tasks. Maybe it goes back to like a more of a sexist stereotype. I would say maybe that's more cultural, but I guess you'd be the expert on India. Yeah. Now, one of the biggest researchers in the field is Dr. Guinevere Eden. What a nice name. From Georgetown University. And they've done one of the biggest research papers into dyslexia and gender and the differences. And she says the results of studies conducted in men are generalized to both sexes. And you've already mentioned this, all of you. And what this is essentially saying is when they were creating the criteria of what is dyslexia and what does dyslexia look like, they did it on males and they just assumed that it'd be exactly the same for females. Now, I'm not saying whether it is or isn't because research is needed, but the fact that they generalized and they made that assumption potentially is having a very negative knock on effect. And so more and more people are kind of getting left behind. You'll also notice if you're in school that in the bottom sets, it is mostly males. And that again isn't because males are less intelligent than females, it's just because the way they demonstrate their behaviour as well as the way they're able to communicate is different. So the first thing we're going to be diving deeper into is biology and developmental. So what do we actually mean by this? This is the process in which humans grow and develop. You know, the classic nature v nurture. Is there something from when we are born to as we grow up that influences whether or not we are dyslexic or whether people think we are? So the first thing I want to ask is, when did you learn to read? Did you learn to read at 4 or 5, 6 or 7, 8 or 9 or 10 plus? Now this might be hard for some of you to remember, but if you can, give it a good guess. Because when you learn to read, it does have an impact on whether or not people assume you are dyslexic. Because as we've mentioned that males learn to read later than females, so naturally males are more likely to get diagnosed at dyslexia. And doctors are more prone, and psychiatrists and all the others are more likely to diagnose when someone's younger because they see more merit in it. Typically, there might be more funding, a whole heap of reasons. So naturally, women are or girls are at a disadvantage. April says, my mum said I learnt to read before I was 4, so it's 5. 4 or 5 was the closest option I chose. Yep, no, that's fine. Me around 1 years old, I'm hyperlexic. Ooh, that's cool. So I can see here that some of you there, but the ones are the one person who was male learnt to read a bit later, and that's very, very typical. But you can already see just because there is a natural reason why females' brains developed in terms of the language processing sector a little bit faster naturally puts them at a disadvantage for getting additional support because they wouldn't seem like they have additional needs. Because what we're doing is we're comparing male and female as exactly the same. And when we look at them from the same point of view, one seems like they're struggling and the other one doesn't. But if we had separate tests, one for different genders, maybe we would start to see an increase in the amount of girls who are getting diagnosis and the support that they need. It's a really complicated thing, I think, to sort, but at least having a basic understanding about what the problem is, we can then start to look to solve it. The next problem, or the next issue that we have for understanding the difference in dyslexia, is school practices. And I know one of you mentioned that already as well, is at school, males are taught and treated differently. So whether or not you had you learnt earlier on as a child, it doesn't really matter. You are going to be treated differently in school. So my next question to you is, what sets were you in? And sets are just a class. So were you always in the bottom sets? Were you in like round about the middle sets? Or were you always like top of the set? Okay, brilliant. So for myself, I was always in the bottom sets. And the bottom sets are not just for people who struggle with the education side, it's also for behaviour. So they kind of like bung all those types of people into the bottom sets. And the challenge there is males are more likely to be disrupted due to testosterone, and that's another impact which impacts dyslexia. It's just one of those things. And also, because they might have had a lower reading age to their female counterparts, naturally they'd be in the lower set. So already, males are starting to stack up on most of the lower ability groups. Now, girls are more likely to be in the top. Fine. But again, if you look and ask yourself, if you are lucky enough to be offered to have a diagnosis for dyslexia in school, how often is it going to be those in the top set? It's not. They're only ever going to do the bottom sets because those are the ones which they deem are struggling, and you're only going to get support if you're struggling. But that doesn't, just because you're intelligent or you're doing well for your age, doesn't mean that you will not need the help later on in life. So again, we've got another bias yet again. So you are at a severe disadvantage if you are doing well early on, if you're dyslexic, than if you are struggling earlier on. And yeah, not ideal. April says, when I was doing my GCSEs at secondary school, I was in the bottom set for maths, but the higher set for English. And that's really interesting because I know in my school and a lot of schools, the sets are kind of anchored together. So let's say you really find English hard, which a lot of dyslexics do. If you're finding science and maths easy, well, sometimes those sets are like joined together, so you end up being in the bottom sets for all of them. And that means you kind of like stunt your development. And if you don't find something challenging or interesting, you kind of zone out. So there's so many things that are tied together which can result in dyslexia's challenges growing and growing. There's many people who are very, very successful who are dyslexic, regardless of their gender. But sometimes the way that society is created and our current systems does kind of exacerbate the troubles and kind of like embeds it into part of your life. The next one is cultural influences. So we've talked about early on development, how you're treated at school, but also the culture that you live in. We've already mentioned like India, it's already different. Erin says, I didn't get an ASD diagnosis until about age 25 because my grades were good, so no one thought I could have a disability. Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about. You can have high grades and be dyslexic as well, and that applies to all the other neurodivergents. The next one we're going to be talking about is cultural influences, so historical, geographical, and family factors that affect assessments and intervention processes. You might not find that this hard to believe, but if you come from an upper class, white background, you are more likely to be diagnosed. And males tend, there is a link between like wealth and gender, depending or how it is distributed amongst families. So let's dive a little bit deeper into this. What activities did you like as a child? Now this might seem irrelevant, but it is. So if you like sports as a kid, that one, music, reading, arts. Okay, we've got some sports lovers, we've got a lot of art lovers. No reading. Music. Okay, there we are. Now, how does this relate to your cultural upbringing, what you like, and how does that even relate to dyslexia? Well, you know, when it comes to is something masculine or feminine, when we live in a society which cares so much about how manly you are and how macho and whether you're the alpha male, it does have an effect. So, for example, sports is considered masculine, so most males will do sports. Music is, I'd say quite can be masculine. Reading and art, though, is feminine. And you might disagree with that, but I would say most young boys growing up would see that as a less masculine activity to do. It would normally be considered weak or not as strong. And as a result, if you're male, you're probably not going to be doing reading as an activity. So again, your reading ability is stunted because of the way that you feel people will witness you. I remember like when you go to school and you say, "Oh, do you read?" And like, "Nah, I hate reading. I've never read a book in my life." And like, are you bragging? Like, it's like they're proud of it, like a badge of honor. So this is how it can kind of be connected. And I don't know about other cultures, but I do know in Western societies that we do put a lot of emphasis on what is manly or feminine, or are you going to make a good man, or are you a woman? And unfortunately, that does impact dyslexia. You can kind of see how it all impacts. So you haven't got just the genetic side, you've also got the societal factors, and you've also got in history. So, how has history viewed dyslexia in the past? Is it okay to be disabled and male? Or is it okay to be disabled and female? A lot of the time, females are seen as carers for the male. So if they have any deficits, they might be less desirable. Now, these aren't my words, these are just sadly how it has been a lot through history, but all these things do have a knock on effect. Okay, Kinga says there's a great documentary about Bob Ross. There is. And all his paintings are like kind of not in the public domain. Actually, lol, men don't like studying and women aren't allowed to study in many places. That is another factor which is true. I only know that from Malala. I can't pronounce the name, but you know who I'm on about. April says, thanks for the heads up. Okay, we've got a nice conversation going about Bob Ross. Okay, now on this one, I just want to know whether you agree or disagree. Dyslexics have different neural origins in each sex. So essentially, the way that the brain is made is different. And the second one is females and males would benefit from different diagnosis and treatments. So at the moment, it's one size fit all. Would it be useful to have a different one? And the reason why I asked your opinion on these is there really isn't a right answer for this. So the first one is they're still doing a lot of studies and research on. And you may have attended a previous webinar where we did the science of dyslexia. And dyslexia happens from in early brain development when our neural pathways are forming and they have to do like neuromigration. So the basic story is your little neurons have to travel somewhere else, and if they kind of get stopped by like a blocker gene or what we call an SNP, you then may have dyslexia. But is it different in males and females? Because maybe it's a different reason. And we do not know yet because most of the research is on males. But what we do know is that estrogen, the female hormone, does interfere differently and does change the whole story around. So when we are looking at the science, again, we're normally looking at it from a male perspective. You're probably starting to see a theme now. We all knew that sexism was a thing, but who knew it even affected things like dyslexia so deeply? So this is a picture of the human brain, and I want you to put a pin, like poke your finger on if you're able to, on the left temporal gyrus or lobe. So a study revealed that male dyslexics have less grey matter in the left temporal gyrus. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Okay, interesting. I mean, do not worry if you get it wrong. It's a very confusing thing. Okay, nice. Now, if any of you put this area, you are right. This is the left temporal lobe. And it's normally split into like different sections here. So you've got the upper, lower, middle. And this is the main area of the human brain which affects speech and verbal communication. So this area is typically the area in dyslexics where we notice less grey matter. And you've got grey matter, all it really is the like kind of like plasticky material in our brain where our neurons develop. And when they kind of going through the research and looking where most of the neuromigration is happening and where it isn't happening, that's the area which most people have figured out is the root area of dyslexia. But is it the same in females? However, female dyslexics have less grey matter in the parietal lobe, which is involved in sensory and motor processing. So this part of the brain is involved about coordination, so hand-eye coordination. So do you know what part of the brain is that? Nice, and I can see a few dots here. So it is, you're right, this top bit. So it is a different part of the brain which is affected, and that involves in where the grey matter. So already that's quite a substantial difference because the brain, they do completely different things. One is about speaking and communication. The other one is about motor processing. So women, it's about motor processing. Males is about speech. Ultimately, you get the same thing. You get different amounts of grey matter. Grey matter might not seem that important, but essentially it's the bedrock of network of communication. So yes, you might both have dyslexia, but the root cause of the dyslexia or how the brain processes it or the challenges comes from a different place. Here is a nice little image of the brain. So in the center, you've got your white matter, and on the outside, you've got grey matter. That isn't always the case with other animals on our planet, but for humans, typically the way around. Fun fact, it's not actually white or grey. It's like a weird gooey colour. But when you slice it in half and you put some liquid on it and, then it becomes white or grey. So do not expect actually white or grey stuff in your head. And depending on how the transitions and like little houses kind of pop up in your brain when you're developing, depends how kind of like thick and juicy it is. And you'll notice like if this is decreased in those with dyslexia. So remember, with those men and female, both have a reduced amount of grey matter in their brains if they're dyslexic, but the area is different. So that is one of the key things that we know is different. But more research is needed because, as always, most of the research has been done on males, and it's only been the George State University that has done more extensive research on the female brain and those with dyslexia. Still, it's quite a small sample size, but at least it's interesting to see that research is happening. Now for our lovely female sex hormone, estrogen or estrogen. And this thing might not seem like a big deal, but it means that the structure in the brain develops quite differently. With dyslexic genes, they're little genes, and depending on if your parents have them, determines whether you have them. And with males, it's normally like the female gene, which kind of carries it across. So, long story short, if you're female, you're more likely to be dyslexic just because of estrogen. And if you're male, less likely. Yet that doesn't add up to what we currently know when it comes to the amount of people that are diagnosed, because males are. So already, the science and the data we have isn't really lining up here. The next expert I want to refer to is Dr. Tanya Evans. Now, she's done a lot of research as well, so definitely one worth checking out if you want a very long study. She says there is sex-specific variance in the brain autonomy, and females tend to use both hemisphere for language tasks, while males use just the left. And we often refer, when we talk about dyslexia, we always talk about the left brain, how the left brain is like, the creative side, dyslexics use the left, but we don't use the right. But again, that's not true. That's true for males and not females. So if you're females, you'll very much use both sides of the brain. And if you use both sides of the brain, maybe you have different tasks or different abilities than your male counterparts. So when you're looking for people who are very creative but might struggle in other areas like, I don't know, maths or numbers, if you're female and you are okay at those areas, maybe you won't even be picked up for being dyslexic. Because the way that we diagnose and look for dyslexia is biased towards females. So females tend to use both hemispheres, so that both chunks of the brain, for language tasks, while males just use the left. So when we're looking at like the grey matter, because grey matter is formed early on, but it's like reinforced as we go through our life. So say the more we use part of our brain, the more connections that are created. So if you're just using one part of your brain mostly, you're going to be seeing more connections, and the other brain is going to have less. And that's an easy way to see maybe someone has dyslexia. But if you're like a female and you're using both sides of the brain, maybe the connections would be just as strong in each side of the brain. Again, it's another like red herring on how some people are missed out or shown maybe not have dyslexia. But obviously we know better now, but a lot of people do not. There's so many things against it. So if you are female and dyslexic, good on you for finally getting recognised, because it is not an easy journey. So the key takeaways is that males are diagnosed with dyslexia more than females. That is a fact. So if you say more males are dyslexic than females, that would be wrong. But if you say more males are diagnosed with dyslexia than females, that would be correct. Just looking at diagnosis alone, males are more likely, but do not get that confused with actually having dyslexia. Next one, reading ability in males is lower than females. That sounds like quite a big statement to say, but there is more than enough evidence to back that up, and not just in the Western world, but all across the planet, time and time again, males have lower reading abilities. But as I mentioned, around 36, which is an oddly accurate number, it tends to even out, and then start to see less of a difference. This is due to processing speeds, inhibition, and verbal reasoning. The last point is processing speed shows, dyslexic mistake, processing speeds shows the differences in both dyslexia and ADHD. And because ADHD is another great gender biased diagnosis, because I won't go into too much detail, but you've got attention deficit hyperactive disorder. A lot of males show the hyperactive side of ADHD, but a lot of females tend to not show the hyperactive, so they tend to be attention deficit disorder without the hyperactiveness. So because males are more likely to show the hyperactiveness, and dyslexia and ADHD are like two peas in a pod, they go together quite frequently, you're more likely to misbehave in school, to get recognised, and then get the dyslexia diagnosis, and you can kind of see how the ball starts rolling. So even before you've even spoke your first word, you've already been pigeonholed, and to be male and to be dyslexic, sometimes you can get misdiagnosed when you're not even dyslexic, but to be female and dyslexic, you have to really go against the odds to get the recognition and the support that you deserve. So it's a massive divide in between whether you are overdiagnosed or underdiagnosed, depending on your gender. Now, just to sum this up, if any of you are dyslexic, do get in touch with us, because we can always support you with getting support in the workplace, regardless of your gender, or regardless if you have a diagnosis. I talk about this most sessions, but as we've got a bit of time, I think it's really good to mention it. If you're in the UK, all you need is a job. And then we do an assessment for an hour, and it's just a friendly chat. And what we do is then we give you a nice report, and why these reports are a bit nicer than the official diagnosis, because if any of you have got any official thing like dyslexia or autism, you'll know that those assessments are really, really negative. I read mine and I wanted to cry. It's like, Nathaniel is incapable of the most basic processes. I was like, oh man, it's like, he is severely underdeveloped for a person his age. Damn it. And it's just like stab with all the negatives. But what we do is we write it from a very positive point of view. So yeah, you may struggle in this area, but in this area you have strengths associated, and then we provide the training. Now, for those of you who are not in the UK, there is support available, but it is still, in the early stages. But what I can say is you can still come to us for support. We just might not be able to help you out with funding. But there are other grants and private organisations which are available. But make sure whenever you are looking for someone who might be able to diagnose you, ask them what is the percentage of males and females that they do. What's their experience? Do they understand about these biases? Do they have an understanding? Because if they do not have an understanding, then you might not get the result you're expecting because they have a lack of understanding. Now, this might be a little bit of an assumption, but most people who I see who are qualified to diagnose people tend to be female. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe that's just the group that I've seen, but it's definitely worth to call them out and just say, are you aware of these unconscious biases and even not so unconscious biases, just to allow them to start thinking around. Particularly if you know that the struggles you have look quite different from the other people around you, particularly if they are male. She just says, remind me of my old report card. Oh, my old report card was dismal. It's like Nathaniel lacks any ambition to pay attention, has like hardly any awareness, and doesn't show any need to progress his view. It was all like doom and gloom. It's like, sound like Dennis the Menace. Erin says, psychology is a female-dominated field 100%. That's definitely what I see, and maybe that comes down to the like how we see jobs, the masculine and the non-masculine jobs. Theresa May, the UK's old Prime Minister, famously said there are boy jobs and girl jobs. She gave guy jobs as taking the rubbish out. No, thank you. We can do so. It's very, very embedded into our culture what we consider masculine and feminine. Even if you think you aren't like influenced by gender norms, you probably are. It's just a thing. Like the fact that I'm teaching disabilities as a male, I'm already in the minority. But the fact I'm disabled a male, I'm in the majority. So it really depends on so many factors. Now I just want any question. Anne says, thank you for another really interesting and informative talk. Really super. Especially the information around gender bias and diagnosis. You're very welcome, Anne-Marie. A lot of the time, like, we don't always dive deep into subjects which are still emerging. And I'd say, though none of this stuff is like 100% proven, because a lot of the sample sizes are still relatively small. And when I say small, we're looking at about like sometimes 500 to 5,000, and ideally we'd want a much larger sample size. It's still worth to take notice, and hopefully we can get more funding for much larger studies. Muscan was wondering if there is any research on dyspraxia. Yes, there is, and we actually have a webinar coming up next year on dyspraxia and sex, as well as ADHD and autism, so I am going to be covering all of those. As you can imagine, dyspraxia is less research than dyslexia. I would say there's a lot of research with ADHD and autism when it comes to gender, then dyslexia, then dyspraxia. I'm not saying it's not there, but most of the things that apply to this webinar would absolutely apply to dyspraxia. Chantel says, with the grey and white matter thing, are there studies linking neurodiversity and Alzheimer's? Really good point, because with Alzheimer's, with the grey matter, basically it starts going to eating away and like holes appear, and then the neural pathways aren't able to connect. So a lot of the time, it isn't that the person has actually lost that information, it's the pathways of finding that information tend to degrade and kind of like disappear, or the connections kind of become a bit dodgy. As to whether or not there's a connection, not to my knowledge. I hope not, at least, but I'm not sure. Can you repeat the underdiagnosed and overdiagnosed part about dyslexia again, please? Absolutely. So males tend to be overdiagnosed, and the reason is because unfortunately we link behavioural needs to disability. So if you've got ADHD or attention challenges, you're more likely to get picked up by the system and go get support and assessment. And you're less likely to mask, which means, I'm dyslexic, YOLO. But females, on the other hand, girls, are more likely to stay in the back of the class, mask, not really show their true colours because they're trying to fit in. And also, they're less likely to get a diagnosis. And if they do get one, they're less likely to get a positive result, as in they are dyslexic, because a lot of the characteristics that we look for, think of it like a checklist, just do not link up to how they might demonstrate in females. Now, can I tell you how different it is in male and female? Unfortunately, I can't because there just isn't the research on it. But what we do know is because of how dyslexia is different in the brain and societal factors, the chances of there being a difference, even a small difference, is significantly high. And as I said at the very beginning of today, we know that there isn't a big difference in male and female. We know that. But just because it's not a big difference doesn't mean it's not an important difference, and doesn't mean that it's not something that we need to dive more deep. I wouldn't be surprised at in future that we had separate criteria. Like, okay, let's diagnose you today. Okay, we're going to use this one, which was created around females, and this one for males. Maybe that would be a better option, but currently that isn't a thing. So are men overdiagnosed or just diagnosed fine? Okay, I can't say like with 100%. I would imagine they can be overdiagnosed or maybe diagnosed fine. That I wouldn't be able to say. We do know though that dyslexia is more common than the amount that are diagnosed, so I suppose you would say technically underdiagnosed still, but compared to females, oh, like comparatively overdiagnosed, but in the grand scheme of things, it just underdiagnosed as well, if that makes sense. You can view all our workshops and webinars on our website, so if you ever want to get back and learn more things, you absolutely can. Oh, Chantel says, as we start seeing more and more people, there are non-gender binaries that will be difficult to separate testing for males and females. That's a really good point, and I did wonder that while creating this today, when I was separating into male and female, I did feel a little bit torn, because on one hand you want to acknowledge that people can be born different, like in a different body or different mindset, but in terms of how that affects you, I'm not so sure. Like if you were born in a male body, but then you resonate as a female in life, would it be the gender you were born with that would have the biggest impact? Or would it be the way that society treats you? I suppose it will always be a balance, but maybe it will come down to, are you treated as a female, as a woman or a girl, or are you treated as a male boy? Because I'm assuming the same biases would come into place depending on how society looks and treats you. It may come down to looks in the end. Maybe it's too early to tell, but it's definitely an interesting thing. Kinga says, maybe it's better to treat each individual as individuals and not in a group of male and female. No, definitely. And then it comes down to, okay, do diagnoses become more individual and more personal? It's an interesting question, and I still think we haven't got the current way fixed yet. So those questions is anyone's guess. Erin, in my research, we record sex and gender separately so we can run analysis based on that. I think that's a good way. Not a lot of people are doing that, but you definitely should be. Because how you resonate does have a massive impact to how you see yourself and how the rest of the world treats you. Nature versus nurture again. It's not either or, it's always both. It will be very interesting to see how this changes in the future and how this affects masking. Absolutely, and I'm completely open to like learning more about it. At Exceptional Individuals, our lovely Kinga here is going to be teaching us about all of this because she has studied gender studies, and Leanne. So I'm looking forward to learning more about the area. So if I have said anything today which is technically politically incorrect, do forgive me. I'm still wrapping my head around the terms, but always here to learn. Muscan says, yeah, neurodivergence is intersex people is another under research topic, I guess. Absolutely. Like, I couldn't find any research on it. So here's our details. I hope you found it useful and a bit of a crash course in the difference. I appreciate no definitive answers were given, but it's definitely an interesting discussion, and I've really enjoyed hearing from all of you and learning more as we go along. Yes, Anne-Marie, looking forward to future events. Yes, and I love to say, my lovely regulars, always great to have you. And if you have any ideas of webinars or topics or things that you'd like me to cover or research, please get in contact because I'm always looking at new interesting ideas which aren't currently tackled online anywhere else. So there's my email address, or it's nat@exceptionalindividuals.com. They both go to the same place, and you can email any ideas you have, and more than happy to do it. And if you want the research for today, I've got all the research. I mainly used a thing called neurobiological sex development difference in developmental. It was a really interesting study. Yeah, so the I use neurobiological sex differences in developmental dyslexia by Anthony J. Kramnick and Tanya M. Evans for today's research. It was a beast of a report, and to be honest, way above my head in terms of the science, but it's the best study that I've seen. So I've tried to take what they've done today and like break it down into manageable chunks. Alright, well, let's go now because the day is still young for some of us, and I'll hopefully see you all next week.